She was 8 months pregnant when she heard her husband tell his men she was nothing but a womb with the last name. Not a metaphor. Not a moment of frustration he'd walk back later. A cold boardroom declaration, delivered between a sip of bourbon and a laugh, that if Evelyn failed to produce a male heir, she would be quietly removed from the Cross household and replaced with someone more strategically suitable. She stood frozen in the hallway outside the study, one hand pressed flat against the wall, the other instinctively covering her belly. The marble was cold beneath her palm. Her husband's voice carried the same tone he used to discuss quarterly earnings and territory disputes. Calm, certain, final. The pregnancy test in her coat pocket suddenly felt like a grenade. If you've ever loved someone who looked straight through you, who reduced you to your usefulness, then you already know exactly what Evelyn felt in that corridor. That particular silence that isn't peaceful at all. That particular stillness before a person decides who they're going to be for the rest of their life. Stay with us. This story goes places you won't see coming. If it moves you, hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. We want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next, because this is only the beginning. The party had been Damien's idea, not a celebration. He didn't use that word. He called it a gathering, the way he called everything that happened inside their penthouse, a gathering, or a meeting, or a necessary function. 30 people in a 17-room apartment, catered by a chef Evelyn had never met, wearing dresses selected by an assistant she'd been assigned rather than chosen. She had stood at the edge of the room for most of the evening, a glass of sparkling water in her hand. She hadn't touched alcohol in 3 months, a fact Damien had not noticed, watching her husband work the room the way other men breathed. Effortless. Automatic. He shook hands and leaned close and laughed at the right moments, and every person he spoke to seemed to straighten slightly, as if proximity to Damien Cross was itself a form of posture correction. He was beautiful in that terrible way powerful men sometimes are. Angular jaw, dark eyes that could pass for warm until you looked long enough to realize they were simply calculating distance. He had married Evelyn 2 years ago in a ceremony that had been photographed for 3 different publications and attended by people whose names appeared in federal investigation files. She had known what she was walking into. Her father had made sure of that. The Ashcroft name buys you into rooms, her father had told her, the week before the wedding. The Cross name keeps you safe inside them. She had been 26. She had believed him. Now she was 28, carrying a child she hadn't yet told her husband about, and she was beginning to understand that there was no such thing as safe inside this world. There was only managed danger, decorated captivity, silence with good lighting. She had slipped away from the main room around 10:30, glass still in hand, moving toward the kitchen corridor that ran behind the study. She needed air, or at least a hallway that didn't smell like $60 cologne and whatever agreements were being made behind the smiles. She heard her name before she heard anything else. Evelyn's been quiet lately. Marcus Hale's voice, Damien's oldest friend, his underboss, a man who had once told her she had good instincts for someone not in the business. She had never decided whether that was a compliment. She's always quiet. Damien, measured, unbothered. You think she knows? A pause. The sound of liquid being poured. Knows what exactly? Damien said. Not a question. That you've been talking to the Belmont girl. Another pause. Longer. Evelyn's hand found the wall. That's a separate matter, Damien said. It's not separate if your wife finds out and decides to become a liability. Evelyn isn't a liability. His tone shifted. Not warmer, but sharper. Precise. The way he spoke when he was making a point he intended to land cleanly. She's an asset. The Ashcroft connection opened the northeastern corridor. The marriage is structurally sound. And if she can't give you what the family needs? Silence. She'll give me a son, Damien said. That's what the arrangement requires. A male heir to carry the Cross name forward. If that doesn't happen naturally, we'll revisit the arrangement. Revisit, Marcus repeated, with the careful neutrality of a man who understood exactly what was being implied. The family requires continuity. I require continuity. If Evelyn can't provide that, the marriage will be restructured, quietly, professionally. She'll be compensated generously. She knows the terms. She didn't know the terms. No one had ever told her there were terms. She had signed a prenuptial agreement drafted by lawyers she hadn't been allowed to consult independently, but nowhere in that document had there been a clause about her body, her fertility, her value as a reproductive function. She had signed a marriage contract, Apparently, she had also signed something else entirely. Her palm pressed harder against the wall. The sparkling water in her glass had gone still. And the child? Marcus asked. If it's a son, it changes everything. If it's not, a short exhale. Not quite a sigh. Something more dismissive than that. We'll cross that when we come to it. If it's not. 3 words. Casual as a weather forecast. Her husband had just discussed the conditional value of their unborn child, a child he didn't even know existed, with the same emotional register he used to discuss shipping routes and zoning permits. Evelyn stood in that corridor for what felt like 3 full minutes and what was probably 45 seconds. She did not move. She did not cry. She had learned very early in this marriage that the walls in this apartment had different acoustic properties than she'd expected, and she had also learned that emotional responses in this household were always observed, assessed, and filed. She breathed, in through her nose, out through her mouth, the way the therapist had taught her 2 years ago, before the therapist's office had been quietly suggested to be a potential security concern and she'd stopped going. Then she straightened, set her glass down on the narrow shelf beside the corridor door, and put her hand in her coat pocket where the folded pregnancy test had been sitting for 6 hours, waiting for the right moment. There was no right moment. There never had been. She had taken the test that morning in the bathroom of a hotel 3 blocks away because she hadn't trusted the privacy of her own home. She had sat on a cold tile floor in a room that smelled like industrial cleaner, watching 2 lines appear, and the first thing she had felt was not joy. It was something closer to dread. Not because she didn't want the child. She did. Fiercely, already, in that immediate and irrational way that had surprised her. But she had known, sitting on that tile floor, that a baby changed the math of her situation in ways she hadn't fully calculated yet. She understood the math now. She walked back through this corridor, back through the kitchen, back into the main room where 30 people were still performing the choreography of Wealth and Alliance, and where her husband stood near the window with a glass of bourbon and the particular half-smile he deployed when he wanted to appear approachable. He saw her across the room, raised his glass slightly, the gesture of a man acknowledging a fixture. She smiled back. She had spent 2 years learning that smile. Then she excused herself to the powder room, locked the door, ran cold water over her wrists, and looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. The woman looking back at her was wearing a $7,000 dress. Her hair was arranged by a stylist who came to the apartment twice a week. Her face was composed and symmetrical and entirely unreadable. She barely recognized herself. She had come from money. The Ashcroft family had been prominent in Connecticut financial circles for 3 generations. But it had been a different kind of money. Old, quiet, crumbling at the edges. Her father's business dealings had grown desperate in the years before the cross-marriage, and the alliance had solved that desperation in ways that had never been discussed openly but were understood by everyone present at the wedding. She had known she was being sold. She had told herself it was a partnership, a practical arrangement between families. She was educated, capable, adaptable. She could build something real inside the structure she'd been handed. But you cannot build a home in a building that considers you load-bearing infrastructure rather than a person who lives there. She dried her hands, unlocked the door. She found Damien's personal assistant, a young man named Colin who communicated primarily through tasteful efficiency, and told him she had a migraine and was going to lie down. Colin would tell Damien. Damien would nod and say something appropriate and continue his conversation. She went to this bedroom. She did not lie down. She sat on the edge of the bed, their bed, the one she'd shared for 2 years with a man who touched her with the careful precision of someone completing a task. And she took the pregnancy test out of her coat pocket and set it on the nightstand. 2 lines. She looked at it for a long time. Then she opened the nightstand drawer and took out a notepad. Not her phone. She knew her phone's activity could be accessed. A physical notepad, the kind that had come with the room's original furnishings and been overlooked in the aesthetic overhaul that had replaced everything personal with everything expensive. She wrote 3 words. I heard everything. Then she tore the page off, looked at it, and tore it into pieces. She wasn't leaving a note. Not yet. Notes could be found, analyzed, used. What she needed wasn't a note. What she needed was a plan. And Evelyn Ashcroft, who had once been called too smart for her own good by a professor who'd meant it as a warning, had always been better at plans than she'd let this household believe. She had not been idle in 2 years. She had been patient. She had quietly, over 18 months, moved small amounts of her personal inheritance, money that predated the marriage, money that was legally hers alone, into an account under her maiden name at a bank in Albany. Not enough to draw attention, enough to matter. She had kept the deed to Blackwood Manor in her private documents, separate from the household files. The estate had been her grandmother's, remote, aging, largely forgotten, transferred to Evelyn in a will that the Cross family's lawyers had apparently not bothered to fully inventory. It sat in the Hudson Valley, 2 hours north of Manhattan, behind a gate that needed oil and a roof that needed 3 different contractors. It was hers. She had driven past it once, 8 months ago, on a supposed shopping trip to Rhinebeck. She had sat outside the gate for 20 minutes, engine running, looking at the house through the bare February trees. It had looked exactly like what it was, something abandoned that still had bones worth saving. She had driven back to Manhattan and not told anyone where she'd been. Now she sat on the edge of a bed that cost more than some people's annual salary, in an apartment that had been designed to impress rather than comfort, carrying a child whose value to her husband was contingent on its sex. And she understood with absolute clarity that the time for patience had just ended. She did not cry. She had given herself permission to cry later, somewhere private, somewhere that wasn't monitored by a man who assessed emotional responses for strategic information. She went to the closet, changed into clothing that could pass for comfortable loungewear, the kind of thing she might wear to read in the library. Practical shoes. Nothing that signaled departure. She took her personal documents from the false bottom of the accessory drawer. She had put them there herself 14 months ago, on the specific day she'd understood that someday she might need them quickly. Passport, bank card, the Blackwood deed, a small envelope of cash. She put them in the inner pocket of a coat she rarely wore, one Damien had never paid attention to. A gray wool coat, slightly too large, that she'd bought herself 3 years before the marriage. She walked back into the bedroom. She stood at the nightstand. She looked at her wedding ring for a long time. It was a 4-carat emerald-cut diamond on a platinum band, surrounded by smaller stones that caught light in a way that had once made her breath catch. She remembered the moment he'd put it on her finger. She had looked for something in his eyes, something that would tell her this was real, that there was a person underneath the architecture of his power who had chosen her specifically. Her, not the Ashcroft name in the northeastern corridor. She had not found it. She slid the ring off, set it on the nightstand next to the pregnancy test. She thought about leaving both. Then she picked up the pregnancy test, looked at it once more, and put it back in her coat pocket. He could have the ring. It belonged to the arrangement. She walked down the back corridor, the one the staff used, the one that bypassed the main rooms and the cameras that monitored the primary exits. She had identified that route 8 months ago, on the same general timeline as the Blackwood visit. She had not planned this specifically, but she had planned for the possibility of this. She had always been better at plans than she'd let them know. The servants' entrance led out into a narrow alley between buildings. The cold hit her face immediately. February, raw and honest in the way that New York could be when there was no performance required. She pulled the coat tighter. She did not look back at the building. She walked to the end of the alley, turned right, and kept moving. Behind her, on the nightstand of the most expensive bedroom she had ever slept in, her wedding ring sat beside an empty space where the pregnancy test had been. In the study 2 floors up, her husband was still talking about territory and continuity and arrangements. In the main room, 30 people were still performing the choreography she had opted out of. None of them noticed she was gone. Not yet. The cold air filled her lungs, and for the first time in 2 years, Evelyn Ashcroft took a breath that felt like it actually belonged to her. She had no idea what she was walking toward. She knew exactly what she was walking away from. And her hand was pressed against her coat pocket, against the hard plastic edge of the test that had changed everything, against the secret she was carrying north into the dark. And for the first time in a long time, the weight of it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like the only thing in her life that was entirely, completely, irreversibly hers. The taxi driver didn't ask questions. That was the thing about New York at 11:30 on a February night. The city had a particular relationship with people who needed to move without explaining themselves. She gave him an address in Midtown, paid cash, and sat in the back seat watching the Manhattan skyline blur past the window while her pulse slowly, reluctantly came down from wherever it had been. She didn't go to Midtown. She had the driver drop her 2 blocks from a car rental agency she had identified 8 months ago, one that operated 24 hours and accepted cash deposits without the theatrical suspicion of the larger chains. She had rented from them once before, alone, on a Tuesday in June, just to confirm the process worked the way she'd calculated. It did. By 12:40, she was on the Taconic State Parkway heading north, a rented Jeep that smelled like someone else's life, the heater working at about 70% capacity, the radio off. She drove with both hands on the wheel and her mind running through the list of everything she hadn't taken, everything she'd left behind, every thread still attached to the life she'd just walked out of. The ring. She'd left the ring. She'd taken the pregnancy test. That said something. She wasn't entirely sure what. The Hudson Valley materialized around her in stages. The city's electric haze fading, the dark thickening on either side of the road, trees emerging from the black in the sweep of her headlights. She had not been this far from Manhattan in 14 months. The distance itself felt like something physical happening to her body. A decompression. Her shoulders dropped approximately 2 inches somewhere around Poughkeepsie. Blackwood Manor's gate was exactly as she remembered it. Iron, ornate in the way of another century, rust bleeding down from the hinges in long orange streaks. The keypad beside it accepted the code she'd set during that February visit. She had driven here specifically to establish that code, to make sure the gate's electronic lock, the one upgrade her grandmother had apparently installed in the mid-90s, still functioned. It did. The gate swung inward with a mechanical groan that seemed to carry across the entire silent valley. She drove up the long approach and parked in front of the house. Sat in the Jeep for a moment with the engine running and the heater pushing its inadequate warmth and looked at the building. It was large and dark and needed work in ways she could feel rather than fully see in the darkness. The front porch sagged on the left side. Several shutters were at angles, suggesting the hinges had given up rather than been removed. But the structure was intact. Her grandmother had maintained the bones. Everything else was just time and neglect, and time and neglect were problems with solutions. Evelyn turned off the engine and got out. The cold was a different animal up here than in the city, cleaner, less negotiated with. She found the hide key her grandmother had installed beneath the third porch step. She had found it during the February visit, stood on this same porch for 20 minutes in the cold, looked through the windows at the sheet-covered furniture inside, and driven back south without going in. She hadn't been ready then. She unlocked the front door and went inside. The house smelled like dust and the particular closeness of a space that had been sealed against winter for too long. She found a light switch, and the entry hall responded with the single working bulb of a chandelier that had 12 sockets and 11 dead ones. In the yellow half-light, she could see the sheet-covered shapes of furniture, the bare wood floors, the walls still holding the ghost rectangles of paintings long since relocated or sold. She stood in the entry hall of her grandmother's house at 1:15 in the morning, pregnant, alone, wearing a gray wool coat that was too large for her. She sat down on the bottom stair and put her face in her hands. She let herself cry for exactly 7 minutes. She timed it. She had her watch, her grandmother's watch, the one thing of value she'd been wearing that belonged to her own history rather than the Cross household's. 7 minutes. She cried the way a person does when they've been not crying for too long and the body finally sends a bill. Then she wiped her face, straightened her back, and started inventorying the house. 3 days passed before Damien noticed. That was the first shock. Not that he noticed, but how long it took. Colin had reported the migraine excuse that first night. Damien had apparently accepted it, finished his gathering, come to the bedroom at 1 in the morning, and found the bed empty. He had, according to the account Marcus would eventually piece together, stood at the door for a moment, then checked her bathroom, then her sitting room, then called her phone. The phone was in her coat pocket, powered off, in the back seat of the rented Jeep in the Hudson Valley. Damien had gone to bed. She would learn this later, in pieces, and each piece would strike her differently. That he had gone to bed. That he had woken up the next morning and assumed she was with her friend Clara in Brooklyn. The one tolerated social connection Evelyn had maintained because she had done that before. Left early, stayed away, returned by dinner. That Colin had fielded a casual inquiry the following afternoon and produced the completely honest answer that he didn't know Evelyn's current location, which Damien had apparently received with mild irritation rather than alarm. On the third day, Marcus found the wedding ring. She imagined that moment with some precision. The ring on the nightstand, the empty space beside it. Marcus picking it up, turning it in his fingers, carrying it down the hall to Damien's study with the particular careful walk of a man delivering news he knows will change the room's atmospheric pressure. Her phone rang 47 times in the 6 hours after that. She was on her knees in the Blackwood kitchen, using a butter knife to lever up a section of warped linoleum, when she picked up the phone and saw the screen. 47 missed calls. 12 texts. She read the texts. The first 4 were variations of "Where are you?" The 5th was "Call me immediately." The 6th was "Evelyn." This is not a discussion. 7 through 11 escalated in a pattern she recognized, the architecture of a man who considered his own concern a form of authority. The 12th was 3 words. "I found it." She turned the phone off again and went back to the linoleum. She did not call him. Not that day. Not the next. It took Damien Cross 4 days to locate her. This was longer than she'd expected, honestly. She had expected his resources to find her faster. The fact that it took 4 days told her something useful. His surveillance apparatus was built for external threats, not for tracking a wife who moved quietly through bureaucratic channels using her maiden name. The call came on the 5th morning, and it wasn't from Damien. It was from Marcus. "You should come home," he said, without a greeting. "I am home," she said. She was standing on the Blackwood porch, a coffee that was slightly too weak because she was working through the house's forgotten pantry supplies, watching the winter bare tree line. Her breath made small clouds. Silence on Marcus's end, then, "He's worried." "He's inconvenienced," Evelyn said. "Those aren't the same thing." Another silence. "Evelyn, I heard the conversation, Marcus, the one in the study, about what I'm required to produce and what happens if I don't." Her voice was level. She had practiced this specific levelness for 3 days. "So before you give me a speech about what he's feeling, I'd like you to consider that I know exactly what I am to that household." The silence this time was different, heavier. "That conversation was," he started. "Don't tell me what it was," she said. "I know what I heard." She ended the call. Her hands were shaking slightly. She made herself notice it without acting on it, the way she'd learned to manage the body's responses to this particular kind of confrontation. The shaking wasn't fear. It was closer to something being released. Marcus called back twice. She didn't answer. Damien called 20 minutes later. She answered on the 4th ring because she had decided she would speak to him once, clearly, so there could be no strategic ambiguity about where she stood. "Where are you?" Not a question, the statement of a man accustomed to answers. "Somewhere that doesn't require my presence at your gatherings," she said. A sharp exhale. "We need to talk about this like adults." "We are talking." "In person, Evelyn. Come home." "That's not home," she said, and she meant it in a way that she thought he might actually hear if he was capable of hearing it. "That apartment is a very expensive location where you manage your assets. I'm removing myself from the asset column." Silence. Then, and she would replay this many times later, "Is this about the conversation?" Not which conversation, just the conversation. He knew exactly what he'd said, and he knew she'd heard it. "Among other things," she said. "That conversation was," he started, and she heard the same reach for explanation that Marcus had attempted, and she cut through it the same way. "Damien." Her voice was quiet, which was more dangerous than if she'd raised it, and some part of him seemed to register that. The silence was different again. "I'm carrying your child." The pause that followed lasted 4 full seconds. She counted. "What?" he said. "I'm pregnant. I have been for 11 weeks. I found out the day of the party." She let that settle for exactly 1 more beat. "And I heard you tell Marcus that if I produced a daughter rather than a son, you'd revisit the arrangement, so you'll understand why I'm not rushing back." She ended the call. She sat down on the porch step, carefully, because the wood was suspect, and put the coffee down and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. Her phone rang immediately. She turned it off. He arrived the next morning. She heard the cars before she saw them, 2 black SUVs grinding up the gravel approach that needed regrading, pulling up in front of the house, with the deliberate unhurriedness of men who had decided to project control rather than urgency. She watched from the upstairs window as Damien got out of the second vehicle. He looked exactly like himself. Dark coat. No tie, which for Damien constituted casual. He stood in front of the manor and looked at the building for a long moment, and she couldn't read his expression from this angle. She went downstairs and opened the front door before he could knock. They looked at each other across the threshold. "You look," he started. "Don't do the thing where you assess how I look," she said. He stopped. She stepped back to let him in, because having this conversation in the cold with his men 15 feet away was not a conversation she wanted to have. He came inside, and she watched him take in the house. The bare floors, the exposed walls where she'd pulled off damaged paneling, the smell of fresh paint in the front room where she'd started with the most salvageable walls. the single working bulb in the chandelier. "You've been here 6 days," he said. 5.5. "You're living like this." "I'm living," she said, "which is more than I was doing in that apartment." He turned to look at her, really look, in a way that was different from the practiced social acknowledgments she'd grown accustomed to across the dinner table, as if she had surprised him by being a person rather than a position. "You're pregnant," he said. "Yes." 11 weeks. Almost 12. He put his hands in his coat pockets. She recognized the gesture. It was what he did when he was managing an internal response, the physical equivalent of closing a door. "You should have told me." "I was going to," she said, "and then I heard what telling you would mean, depending on the outcome." That conversation was exactly what it sounded like, she said. "I know the difference between context and content, Damien. Don't explain it to me." His jaw tightened. "What do you want me to say?" "I don't want you to say anything. I want you to understand that this," she gestured at the house, at herself, at the space between them, "is not a tantrum. I'm not waiting for you to come apologize so I can feel better and come home. I am home. I'm going to have this baby here, and I'm going to raise it here. And if you want to be a part of that, then we're going to have a very different conversation than any conversation we've had in the past 2 years." He stared at her. "You can't stay here. This building is mine," she said. "The deed is in my name, has been since my grandmother died. Your lawyers apparently overlooked it." Something moved across his face. Not quite surprise. Damien Cross had trained himself out of visible surprise, but a recalibration. She had outmaneuvered him on a technicality he hadn't known existed, and they both understood what that meant. "This area isn't secure," he said. "Then don't send anyone after me who'd make it unsafe." "That's not what I mean." His voice dropped, and for a moment she heard something that might have been genuine underneath it. "I have enemies, Evelyn. You know that. You walking out doesn't end your exposure. It possibly increases it." "I understand that," she said. "I made the choice anyway." He looked at her for a long time. The working light caught the angles of his face in a way that reminded her of the first time she'd met him. A charity event in Greenwich, her father at her elbow, this man across the room being precisely what everyone told her he was. She had thought that first evening, he is exactly what he appears to be, and that is its own kind of honesty. She had been wrong about that. He was exactly what he appeared to be in public. What he appeared to be in private was something she'd spent 2 years trying to locate and never quite finding. "I need to know the child is safe," he said. "Then the child needs a mother who isn't—" She stopped herself, reorganized, chose words that were accurate rather than merely angry. "The child needs a mother who is a person, not an asset. I stopped being able to be that in your building." He looked away from her toward the front room, at the wall she'd been repainting. She had taped the edges carefully, done the cutting in by hand with a 2-inch brush at 6 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, working by lamplight. The paint smells sharp and honest and entirely her own mess to make. She watched him look at the paint on the wall. "You did that," he said. "Yes." A long pause. "You know how to paint walls." "I know how to do a great many things you never asked about," she said. He left an hour later. He did not ask her to come home again. He stood at the door of his SUV and looked at the house once more, and then he looked at her standing on the porch, and he said, with the particular flatness of a man filing information for later, "I'll send someone to look at the roof." "Don't," she said. He got in the car. The SUVs went back down the gravel approach and through the gate. She stood on the porch until the sound of the engines disappeared. Then she went back inside and sat at the kitchen table and allowed herself exactly 3 minutes to feel the complicated, non-categorizable thing that his presence had left in the room. Not grief, not relief, not quite anger, something compounded of all three. Before she got up, rinsed her coffee mug, and went back to the linoleum. The next 3 weeks were the most productive of her adult life. She hired a local contractor named Bill, who showed up when he said he would, worked without commentary on her life choices, and charged her fair rates from the Albany account. She had the roof assessed by her own contractor with her own money, and the repairs started within the week. She ordered a proper bed, books, a decent space heater for the bedroom she'd claimed, and the particular brand of prenatal vitamins her doctor in the city had recommended before she'd quietly transferred her care to a midwife practice in Rhinebeck that did not ask about her last name. She learned the property's rhythms, the way the wind came off the river on northeastern nights, driving through the gaps in the old window frames, the specific silence of the valley at 4 in the morning when there was no city noise to fill the spaces between her own thoughts. She learned to find the silence useful rather than threatening. She spoke to her mother once, briefly. Her mother was in Connecticut, aware of the marriage's difficulties in the vague way she was aware of most things that required direct engagement, and Evelyn told her only that she was staying at Blackwood for a while. Her mother said, "Oh, that old place," and then pivoted to a story about a neighbor's renovation, and Evelyn let her pivot and ended the call with something like exhausted tenderness. She did not speak to Damien again for 9 days. When he called again, it was 7 in the morning, and she was on the porch with her better coffee. She had found a good local roaster in Rhinebeck, watching a pair of crows argue in the oak tree at the edge of the property. "I want to come up again," he said. "Why?" "Because we need to talk about what happens next." "I've told you what happens next." "Not everything," he said. "There are things you don't know. About the situation. About what's at stake right now with the Romano business." She knew the Romano name. Every person adjacent to the Cross organization knew the Romano name the way people in flood zones know which direction the river runs. Vincent Romano was Damien's most significant rival. Northeastern territories, overlapping interests, a history of negotiations that had never quite produced lasting agreements. "What about Romano?" she said, and her voice had changed slightly, because she was not naive, and the particular way Damien had said the Romano business had a weight to it she recognized. "He knows about the baby," Damien said. She went very still. The crows were still arguing in the oak tree. One of them won, and the other relocated to the fence line, ruffling its feathers with injured dignity. "How?" she said. "We're working on that." "Damien." Her voice went flat and quiet in the way it had on the porch 2 weeks ago. "How does Vincent Romano know I'm pregnant?" A pause. "We believe there's an internal source," he said. "Someone who's been passing information. We haven't identified who yet." "Someone inside your organization is selling information to Romano." "Yes." She let that sit for a moment. The implications unwound in sequence, each one colder than the last. If there was a leak inside Damien's organization, then everything she'd said on that phone call, the pregnancy, her location, her defiance, had potentially been passed along. If Romano knew she was pregnant and had left Damien's protection, and if he was assessing the situation for strategic opportunity, "He's going to come after me," she said. Not a question. "I think he's going to try to use you," Damien said, "either as leverage against me or as an asset for himself. He's going to offer you something, protection, a new identity, resources, something that sounds like freedom. And if I take it, then you become a weapon against everything I've built." She stood up from the porch step, paced to the end of the porch, turned, came back. The baby moved, a flutter, still new enough to be startling, the body's insistence on making the future present. "And if I don't take it," she said, "then what? You send security here? You station men at my gate and around my property, and I become a supervised asset again, just in a different location?" "I don't know," Damien said, and she recognized the specific weight of those 3 words, because Damien did not often admit to not knowing things. "I don't have a version of this that I'm satisfied with. I'm telling you the truth about the situation." "That's new," she said. He didn't respond to that. She stood at the end of the porch and looked at the gate at the bottom of the long approach, the one with the rust bleeding down the iron hinges. Beyond it, the county road ran quiet and empty in the winter morning. It would not stay empty. She understood that now. "If Romano contacts you," Damien said, "I need you to tell me." "Why would I tell you anything?" she said, and she heard how it sounded. Not rhetorical, genuinely uncertain. "Give me a reason, Damien, one real one." The silence stretched long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Because whatever I am," he said, finally, "I'm not Romano. And whatever our arrangement has been, the child is mine, and I won't let him use either of you." It wasn't love. It wasn't even close to an apology. It was a man stating the minimum he was willing to guarantee. But it was the most honest thing he had said to her in 2 years. She said, "I'll think about it," and ended the call. She stood on the porch of Blackwood Manor with her coffee going cold and her hand on her abdomen and the oak tree rustling where the crow had returned. And she thought about a world in which the only 2 options available to her were the man who'd treated her like inventory, or the man who wanted to turn her into a weapon. She thought about the baby, the flutter, the future that was coming whether she was ready for it or not. She thought about the conversation she'd heard through the study wall, about revisiting the arrangement, and she thought about the 4-second pause when she'd told Damien she was pregnant, and she thought about Romano, whom she'd never met, preparing something she couldn't yet see. The morning light was thin and gray and very clear. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She looked at it for 2 full rings. She answered. Mrs. Cross, said a voice she had never heard before. Smooth, measured, carrying the particular confidence of a man who believed the conversation was already going his way. My name is Vincent Romano. I think it's time we had a conversation that your husband doesn't know about. She did not say hello back. That was the first thing. The refusal to mirror his opener, to slide into the social mechanics of a conversation he'd constructed to put her at ease. She had learned that trick from watching Damien workrooms for 2 years. The person who sets the register of the conversation controls its direction. How did you get this number? She said. The same way I get most things, Romano said, carefully. She walked off the porch into the entry hall and closed the front door behind her. The house was quiet. Bill and his crew weren't due until 10. She was completely alone, and she made herself think clearly about that fact rather than feel it. I know what you're going to offer me, she said. Damien already told me. A brief pause. The sound of a man recalibrating without showing it. Did he? What did he say? Protection, new identity, resources, something designed to sound like freedom. And does it? Romano's voice had a quality she was identifying in real time. Not warm, exactly, but interested. The way certain intelligent people sounded when they encountered someone they hadn't fully accounted for. Sound like freedom? It sounds like a different kind of leash, she said, with a different hand holding it. Silence. Then something she hadn't expected. A short laugh, genuine rather than performed. You're smarter than he described. He described me to you. His people talk. Mine listen. A shift in his tone, the easy manner pulling back, something more direct underneath. Mrs. Cross, I'm not calling to recruit you. I want you to understand something your husband won't tell you about the situation you're actually in. I'm listening, she said, because she was, and because refusing information on principle was a luxury she could no longer afford. The leak inside Damien's organization, Romano said. He told you there is one. Yes. Did he tell you who? She said nothing. Adrian Cross, Romano said, his cousin, has been working with my organization for 4 months. Not ideologically. Adrian doesn't have ideology. He has debts. Gambling, primarily. The number is significant. She stood in the entry hall, her back against the closed door, and let the name settle. Adrian Cross. She knew him. Tall, loose-limbed, with the particular charm of someone who'd grown up adjacent to real power and learned to traffic in reflected light. He came to family gatherings, told stories that were usually at someone else's expense, and had once told Evelyn at a Christmas dinner 18 months ago that she was wasted on Damien. She had thought it was a compliment. She had thought a lot of things. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because Adrian knows you're at Blackwood Manor. He's the one who gave us your location. And in approximately, she heard the faint shift of a man checking a watch or a phone. 48 to 72 hours, I'm going to make a decision about what to do with that information. I wanted you to have the window. The window to do what? To make a choice before the choice gets made for you. She moved away from the door, pacing the length of the entry hall. 6 steps. Turn, 6 steps back. The floor creaked on the 4th step. She had been meaning to have Bill look at that. You're telling me this, she said slowly, which means you want something in return. Something specific. What is it? Another pause. This one appreciative rather than surprised. Nothing you're unwilling to give. A conversation, in person. There are things about Damien's operation that his lawyers have kept off the books. Things that would interest certain federal parties. If you were willing to sit down with my attorney and confirm what you observed during your marriage, you want me to testify against my husband, she said. I want you to have a conversation, Romano said, that could result in federal intervention that dismantles the Cross organization cleanly and legally, which would mean Damien goes to prison rather than to war, which is, objectively, a better outcome for everyone involved, including your child. She stopped pacing. The baby moved again, stronger than the flutter she'd felt on the porch. An actual identifiable movement, a knee or elbow asserting itself against the interior wall of her. You have 48 hours, Mrs. Cross, Romano said. I'd suggest not spending them on the phone with your husband. He ended the call. She stood in the entry hall of Blackwood Manor for a long time, phone in her hand, the house settling around her in its ordinary creaks and sighs, And she thought about Adrian Cross telling stories at Christmas dinner with that loose-limbed charm, and about the 4 months during which everything she and Damien had said near an open phone or a staffed room had traveled to this man's ears, and about the 48-hour window, which was not generosity. It was a clock. She called Damien. He answered before the first ring finished. "Romano just called me," she said. The silence that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds she heard something she had rarely heard from Damien Cross, the sound of a man who had not anticipated something. "Where are you?" he said. His voice had changed. The controls still there, but tighter. Load-bearing. "In the house, alone. Stay inside, don't open the gate. I'm sending—" "He told me about Adrian," she said. The second silence was different from the first. Much longer. She counted to 7 before he spoke. "What exactly did he say?" "That Adrian has been working with Romano for 4 months. That Adrian is the source of the leak. That Adrian is the one who gave Romano my location." She let each sentence land separately. "Is it true?" A pause that felt like something tearing. "We've been investigating." Damien. Flat, quiet. The register that he'd learned by now meant she was not going to be managed. "Is it true?" "We believe so," he said. "Yes." She sat down on the bottom stair, the same stair where she'd sat on the first night, crying her 7 minutes. It seemed like another woman's memory. "Your cousin," she said. "Yes." "Who was at our wedding?" "Yes." "Who has been in your home?" "In our home." "Who has been in the same rooms as me for 2 years while he was selling information about where I slept and what I ate, and when I—" She stopped, drew a breath through her nose. "Your cousin, Damien." "I know." His voice had dropped to something she'd never heard from him before. Not grief. Damien was not a man who permitted grief in his register, but the sound underneath grief, the structural thing that grief is built on top of. "I know what it is. I know what he did. We're moving on it." "Romano offered me a deal," she said. Another silence. "He wants me to confirm what I observed during the marriage. Testify, essentially. He framed it as federal intervention that dismantles your organization without violence." She paused. "He said it would be better for the baby." "He said that specifically." Not a question. The flat assessment of a man cataloging a tactic. "Yes." "And what did you tell him?" "I told him nothing. I called you." She stood up from the stair, walked to the window beside the front door and looked out at the long gravel approach, the bare trees, the gate at the bottom. Nothing moving. "But I want you to understand that I'm not calling you because I'm afraid of Romano. I'm calling you because I think you deserve to know what he said. And because—" She paused, finding the honest version of this, "because whatever I think of you right now, I don't want to be his instrument any more than I wanted to be yours." She heard him exhale. It was not a sound she had heard from him before. Something compressed, releasing. "I'm coming up," he said. "I know," she said. She ended the call and went to stand at the kitchen window, looking out at the back property. The old garden, its raised beds collapsed into themselves, the stone wall along the property line, the tree line beyond. The morning light was still gray and thin. She thought 48 hours. She thought Adrian Cross at Christmas dinner, smiling, telling stories. She thought 4 months. Damien arrived in 90 minutes, which meant he had been moving before she called. Already in transit when her call came, already responding to information he had that she didn't. She noted that without comment when she opened the front door. He came in without being invited, which was Damien, and he stood in the entry hall and looked at her with an expression she didn't have a word for. Not remorse, she would not call it remorse. Something more structural. The look of a man who has finally run the full accounting on a decision he made a long time ago and found the total. "You have to leave here," he said. "I just got here." Evelyn. He pulled off his coat, which was the first time she had ever seen him do that without a hanger immediately available. Just dropped it over the stair rail, which told her something about his internal state. "If Romano knows this location, it's not secure. I don't care about the legal architecture of the deed. He will move on this location." "Then give me something better," she said. "Because I'm not going back to the penthouse." "I'm not asking you to go back to the penthouse." He turned to face her fully. "I have a property in Connecticut. Small. Private road. I had it purchased through a corporate structure that isn't connected to my name. Romano won't have it." "You had it prepared," she said slowly. "You had a property prepared." "I had options prepared, in case the situation required them." She looked at him. When did you prepare them? He held her gaze. About 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, when she'd first disappeared. He had started preparing contingencies within the first 72 hours, which meant he'd taken her disappearance more seriously than his 4-day response time had suggested. He had simply not showed it. You prepared a safe house for me, she said, while I was also preparing one for myself. Yes. And you weren't going to tell me about it. I was trying to find the right... There's no right moment, Damien. Her voice was tired rather than sharp. There is only what's true and when you say it. He looked away from her. At the paint on the front room wall. At the chandelier with its one working bulb. At the place where she'd pulled the damaged paneling and left the original wood underneath, old and bare, and better than what had been covering it. I'm trying, he said. It was the simplest thing she'd heard him say in 2 years. She didn't respond to it, because she didn't know how to yet, and she had learned the hard way that reaching for something before she was ready produced words she couldn't take back. Tell me about Adrian, she said instead. He sat down at the kitchen table, just sat down, at her kitchen table, in the house she was rebuilding, without being asked. He came to me in October, told me he had a cash problem. I gave him money once, 20,000, which for Adrian is an afternoon. He came back in November. I told him no. I told him he needed to handle his own situation. His hands were flat on the table. We found out last week that he'd been talking to Romano's people since September, a month before he came to me. He came to you as cover, she said, to make it look like he'd tried to come to family first. Yes. She sat down across from him, not because she wanted to be close to him, because she was tired and her back hurt in the specific way it had started hurting 3 weeks ago, a low, persistent ache that the midwife had told her was normal and would not stop being present for approximately the next 6 months. What information did he sell, she said. Security schedules, territory arrangements, and... He stopped. And? Conversations. He sold recorded conversations. She looked at him steadily. Including the one in the study, he said, at the party. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, a wind picked up through the oak tree, the branches tapping the window glass with the irregular rhythm of something trying to get in. Romano has a recording, she said, of your conversation with Marcus, about the air requirement, about revisiting the arrangement. Yes. He played it for me, in a way, she said. Not the recording, but he knew exactly what to say to me, what I'd want to hear, that you'd treated me like a function. She kept her voice level. He knew because he had the recording, and Adrian gave it to him. Yes. And the recording is also why Romano thinks I'd be receptive, because he knows I heard it, because he knows what I know. She looked at the table surface between them. He built his entire pitch on information that your cousin extracted from the worst moment of your marriage and sold to your enemy. Yes, Damien said for the 4th time, and each time he said it, the words seemed to cost him something new. Are you angry? She asked. He looked up at her. At Adrian? At yourself. A long pause. His hands were still flat on the table. She could see the tendons in them from here, the slight tension that showed he was working at being still. Yes, he said. She nodded once. Not forgiveness. Not anywhere near that. Just acknowledgement that the answer was the right one. What's your plan for Adrian, she said. We're going to bring him in, confirm what we know. And then... He stopped. And then... Handle it, he said. She didn't ask what that meant. She had lived adjacent to this world long enough to understand that some questions, once answered, changed what you were complicit in. She left it alone. The 48 hours Romano gave me, she said. I know about it. You were already moving before I called you. We intercepted his call. We know he contacted you. She absorbed that. You've had my phone monitored. He met her eyes. No, his. We've had Romano's communications monitored for 6 weeks. She thought about that for a moment and decided to triage it. It was a problem and also a smaller problem than several other problems currently active. So you know what he's planning. We know he intends to use the 48-hour window to move men into position, whether he's expecting you to take his offer or not. Damien's voice settled into the particular flatness that meant he was managing information he found unpleasant. Romano is going to come here not to negotiate, to take. The words sat on the table between them like something with weight. Take, she repeated. You and the child are leverage, whether you cooperate or not. She put both hands flat on the table, mirroring his posture without intending to. The kitchen was cold. The back of the house held cold in a way the front rooms didn't, a draft from the window frame she hadn't gotten to yet. She could feel it at her ankles. "How long do we have?" she said. "My best estimate is tonight. He won't wait the full 48. That was a frame. A way to make you feel like you had time to decide." He paused. "You don't have time." "I never had time," she said. They looked at each other across the kitchen table, in the house she'd been rebuilding for 5 weeks, with the paint still drying on the front room wall, and the roof newly repaired and the linoleum half pulled from the kitchen floor. And she understood that this house, this particular act of rebuilding, was about to be interrupted in a way that might not be recoverable. "What happens now?" she said. "I bring my people in. They secure the property, and we wait for Romano to make his move on a position that's prepared for him. You want to use my house as a trap?" "I want to use it as a prepared defense," he said. "There's a difference." "Not to the house," she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word, which surprised her, and she pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment before looking back at him. He was watching her with the expression she still didn't have a word for. "The property can be repaired," he said quietly. Again. "I know," she said. She stood up, walked to the window and looked out at the back garden. The collapsed raised beds, the stone wall, the tree line where the light was now white and flat and completely winter. "Call your people," she said. She heard him reach for his phone. She stood at the window and watched the tree line and thought about Adrian Cross at Christmas dinner, smiling with someone else's information in his pocket. And she felt something move through her that was colder than the draft at her ankles and more precise than anger. She had been a piece moved on someone else's board for so long that she had forgotten she had her own hands. That was going to change. Damien's security team arrived in 4 vehicles within the hour. 8 men who moved through the property with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before and did not need to discuss it. She watched them from the porch, arms crossed, the cold working at the back of her neck. Their commander was a man named Reyes, compact, dark-eyed, who introduced himself to Evelyn with the specific courtesy of someone who understood that she was not incidental to the situation. He walked the property perimeter with her when she asked, explained what they were doing and why without talking down to her, and answered her questions directly. She appreciated that. The afternoon went dark early, the way February afternoons did, the light dropping from gray to charcoal to black, in a compression that felt faster than it actually was. By 6, the house was set. By 7, Damien's men were in position, some inside, some at points around the property, and the manor was quiet in the charged way of a place holding its breath. Evelyn sat in the kitchen with Damien and Reyes and drank tea she didn't taste and listened to the occasional brief radio exchanges between Reyes and his men outside. She had changed into warmer clothes and flat shoes with good grip. She had done this without Damien suggesting it, and she had noticed him notice it without comment. At 9:47, Reyes's radio crackled. "Vehicle on the county road," came the voice. Slowing at the gate, second vehicle behind the first. Reyes looked at Damien, then at Evelyn. "I need you away from the windows." She stood up. "Where?" "Interior hallway, center of the house." He was already moving, his hand going to the radio. "There are only 2 vehicles," she said. "So far," Reyes said, and there was something in those 2 words that told her the rest. She moved into the center hallway. Damien appeared beside her, not taking her arm, not physically managing her, simply moving to be adjacent, which she filed without comment. The sound of the gate being forced was metallic and brief, and then the gravel approach was alive with engine noise, more than 2 vehicles now, the sound multiplying as it came up the long drive. Then everything happened at the same time. The windows on the east side of the house exploded inward. Not gunfire, concussion devices. She understood this in some detached analytical part of her mind, while the rest of her mind was simply registering the noise and the flash and the fact that she was moving, Damien's hand at her back, both of them pressing to the interior wall as the house filled with the sound of men in motion. Reyes's team moved to meet them. The firefight was not like anything she had heard before. Not cinematic, not rhythmic. It was close and percussive and completely without arc. Just the terrible immediate present tense of each second containing only itself, sound and motion, and the specific cold of the hallway floor beneath her hands when Damien pulled her down. "Stay down," he said, close to her ear. "I know," she said. She pressed her back to the wall. Her hand was on her abdomen. She hadn't made a decision to put it there. Her body had simply done it. The baby was still, as if it too was listening. The sounds moved through the house in waves. She tracked them. Reyes's team holding the entry, the east side active, the back of the house. The back of the house. She had told Bill about the kitchen window, the one with the worst draft, the one she'd been meaning to get to. She had not told Reyes about the kitchen window. She grabbed Damien's arm. The kitchen window, east-facing. The frame is... She heard it before she finished the sentence. The distinct sound of old wood giving way under pressure, different from the percussion of the entry, quieter, and therefore worse. Damien was already moving, pulling her further down the hallway, away from the kitchen, toward the stairs. The man who came through the kitchen door was not one of Romano's soldiers. She saw his face in the light from the hallway, familiar, loose-limbed, wearing an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the Christmas dinner charm, not the reflected light ease, something stripped down to what it actually was underneath. Adrian Cross looked at her across the hallway with the expression of a man who had already made every decision he intended to make. "Evelyn," he said, with a kind of terrible familiarity, "you should have taken Romano's offer." Damien stepped in front of her. Adrian raised the gun in his right hand with the specific unhurriedness of someone who had planned this moment and found the planning sufficient. "Move," Adrian said to Damien, "and I'll put it through her instead." The hallway was very quiet suddenly. The sounds from the rest of the house had not stopped, but they had receded, the way background noise does when the foreground becomes absolute. Damien did not move. "Adrian," he said. His voice was the flattest she had ever heard it. "Put it down." "I've been putting things down for 34 years, Adrian said. "Every time this family needed something from me, every time you needed something, I put things down." His gun hand was steady, steadier than it should have been for a man in this situation, which told her he had been here before in some form, or had practiced being here. "I'm not putting anything down tonight." "The gambling debts," Damien said. "I would have handled it." "You told me no in November." "I told you to come back with the actual number. You disappeared instead." "Because the actual number was going to change how you looked at me," Adrian said, and for the first time something cracked in his voice. Not remorse, but the specific rawness of someone exposing the thing they most wanted to protect. "And I couldn't stand the way you look at me already. Like I'm furniture. Like I'm adjacent. Like I'm the cousin who gets invited to Christmas because it would be rude not to." She was watching Adrian's face, and she was also watching his gun hand, and she was also watching Damien's shoulders, the set of them, the way he was managing the geometry of this hallway. She understood he was calculating. She understood he needed time to finish the calculation. She spoke. "Adrian," she said from behind Damien's shoulder, "I heard you at Christmas dinner. You said I was wasted on him." Adrian's eyes moved to her, just briefly, just the flicker. "Did you mean it?" she said. "Evelyn," Damien started. "Did you mean it?" she said again, and her voice was entirely level, the levelness she had been practicing for years, the one that lived on the other side of fear. Adrian's expression shifted, the stripped-down thing underneath it moving, something else pushing through. "I meant that you deserved better than what he was giving you," he said. "That part I meant." "And now?" she said. "What do I deserve now?" "I don't have a choice now," he said. "Romano needs this done, and I owe Romano things I can't pay any other way." "You do have a choice," she said. "You're making it right now, and it's the worst one available to you, because whatever Romano has promised that my family doesn't get touched," Adrian said, and his voice broke on the word family in a way that recontextualized everything she thought she understood about his motivation. "I have a daughter, Evelyn. She's 4. Romano knows where she lives." The hallway went completely still. Damien's shoulders changed. Something in the geometry shifted. "Romano threatened your daughter," Damien said. Adrian's gun hand was no longer entirely steady. "He didn't threaten," Adrian said. "He informed. He let me understand what the situation was." "Why didn't you come to me?" Damien said, and his voice had changed entirely, the flatness gone, something raw and real and furious underneath. "Adrian, why didn't you come to me?" "Because I didn't know if you'd help or if you'd use it," Adrian said. "Because I don't know anymore what you are. I used to think I knew. I used to think family meant something in this house beyond," his voice broke again, "beyond what you can produce for it." The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. In the 5th second, Reyes came through the door at the end of the hallway behind Adrian, and Adrian heard him, and everything that happened next was very fast and very loud, and ended with Damien on the floor with a bullet in his left shoulder, and Adrian zip-tied against the wall, and Evelyn standing in the center of the hallway, with her back pressed to the plaster, and both hands covering her abdomen, and her breath coming in the specific shallow bursts of a body managing more adrenaline than it had been designed for. Reyes was saying something to her. She couldn't process the words immediately. She watched Damien on the floor, conscious, hand pressed to his shoulder, face the color of unfinished plaster. And she crossed the hallway and went down on her knees next to him without deciding to, the floor cold and hard under her knees. And she put her hand over his on the wound because pressure mattered more than the rest of it right now. He looked at her. His eyes were very dark and very close. "I'm fine," he said. "You're not," she said. "I will be." She pressed harder on the wound. He winced, the first physical response to pain she had ever seen from him. It was such a human thing that it struck her somewhere she hadn't expected. "Rowan," she said. It came out of nowhere. She hadn't planned it. "What?" he said. "If it's a boy," she said, keeping her eyes on the wound, keeping pressure, listening to Reyes coordinate on the radio. "Rowan. That's what I want to call him." Damien was quiet for a moment. She could feel his breath, the labor of it, the shoulder working harder than it should be to keep up. "Rowan Cross," he said. "Rowan Ashcroft Cross," she said. Another pause. "All right," he said. Outside, the last of the sound had stopped. The house was settling back into itself, the old bones adjusting to what had just moved through them. She could hear, faintly, Reyes on the radio, the cleanup beginning, the world outside the hallway resuming its ordinary machinery. She kept her hand on Damien's wound and she looked at Adrian on the other side of the hall, zip-tied, face wet, looking at nothing with the expression of a man who had run out of moves 8 moves ago and had kept playing anyway. She thought about his daughter, 4 years old, a child Romano had used like a coordinate on a map. She thought about her own child, the name she'd just said out loud for the first time. She thought about the world these children were going to grow up inside if nothing fundamental changed. The blood was warm under her palm, and the floor was cold under her knees, and the house was quiet in the way it was quiet after something irreversible had passed through it. And Evelyn understood with complete clarity that the woman who had driven north 5 weeks ago, alone, with a pregnancy test in her pocket and a plan built on patience and property law, no longer existed in any useful form. That woman had been preparing to survive at the edges of this world. What was required now was something else entirely. Someone willing to walk to the center of it and change what was there. She pressed her hand harder against Damien's shoulder, and she made herself breathe, and she began to think about what came next with the specific cold focus of someone who has finally decided to stop surviving and start deciding. The hospital in Poughkeepsie smelled like antiseptic and forced calm. Evelyn sat in a plastic chair outside the surgical suite with her coat still on. Damien's blood had dried on her right palm in a rust-colored crescent that she had not washed off, partly because there was no sink immediately available, and partly because she found, in some detached way, that she wasn't ready to. It was evidence of something. She wasn't sure what yet. Reyes sat 2 chairs down, phone to his ear, running the cleanup at Blackwood with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this kind of arithmetic before. She could hear fragments, secure the perimeter, confirm the count, get Adrian into the car, not the facility. And she let the fragments wash past her without assembling them into pictures she'd have to carry. The waiting room had 3 other people in it. A woman in her 60s with a rosary she kept working through her fingers without apparent awareness. A young man with a split lip who had arrived before them and hadn't been called yet. A teenager asleep across 2 chairs with a jacket over her face. Ordinary suffering. The kind that happened without anyone having sold information to a crime syndicate. Evelyn pressed the heel of her clean hand against her sternum and breathed. The baby had been still since the hallway. She had been monitoring this, checking against her own body the way she'd learned to in the past weeks, the internal accounting that had become automatic. She needed the baby to move. As if hearing the thought, it did. A slow roll, more substantial than the flutter, more definite than the knee or elbow she'd felt before. An assertion. She put both hands on her abdomen, dried blood and all, and closed her eyes for 15 seconds. Then she opened them and thought about Romano. Damien came out of surgery at 2:17 in the morning. The bullet had passed through the shoulder without hitting the subclavian artery, which the surgeon described as fortunate, in the particular tone of someone accustomed to presenting worse options. There would be physical therapy. There would be a recovery period. He would be functional in ways that currently mattered within 48 hours if he was stubborn about it. She had the strong impression he would be stubborn about it. They put him in a private room. She sat in the chair beside the bed and watched him come back from the anesthesia in stages. The small movements first, the hands, then the turn of his head, then the eyes opening with the specific unfocused quality of a person who had not yet reassembled their understanding of where they were. He found her face. "The baby," he said. First words. Not "where am I" or what happened or anything about himself. "Fine," she said. Moving. He exhaled and closed his eyes again for a moment. "Romano," he said, without opening them. "Still out there." "Adrian." "Reyes has him." He opened his eyes again and looked at the ceiling with an expression she recognized. The internal inventory of a man assessing what he still had available to work with. She had watched him do this at dinner parties when conversations went sideways, at the 2 business meetings she'd been present for early in the marriage before being quietly excluded from them. He did it faster than most people. It was, she thought, both his most useful quality and the one that had most consistently made her feel like a variable rather than a person. "He's going to move again," Damien said. "Romano. Tonight failed, which means he's already recalculating. He won't wait." "I know," she said. "I need to get out of this bed. You need to not bleed to death. Those aren't mutually exclusive." He started to push himself upright and she watched the pain cross his face. Not a wince this time, something larger, a full-body flinch that he compressed almost immediately back into control. Almost. "Damien." She stood up, put a hand on his chest, not gently, with actual pressure, the way you stopped something moving rather than the way you comforted it. "You have a team. Use them. That's what they're there for." He looked at her hand on his chest, then at her face. "You're not afraid," he said. "I'm terrified," she said. "Those aren't the same thing either." He was quiet for a moment. Then he lay back against the pillow, and she removed her hand and they sat in the particular silence of 2 people who have been through something extreme together and are now recalibrating their understanding of each other. "Romano is going to reach out again," Damien said to the ceiling. "Before he moves. He'll try once more to get you to cooperate. He'll use Adrian's daughter as the frame, make you think that saving her requires you working with him." "Will she be safe?" Evelyn said. "Adrian's daughter." "I have people on her already," Damien said, "as of an hour ago." She looked at him. "You moved people to protect a child." "She's 4 years old," he said, "and she's Adrian's. Whatever Adrian did—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "She didn't do anything." Evelyn sat back down in the chair, looked at his profile against the hospital pillow, the angles she knew, the ones she'd spent 2 years studying for something underneath and not always finding it, and thought, there it is, the thing underneath. Small and stubborn and apparently capable of making decisions at 2 in the morning that didn't require a strategic calculation. "When Romano calls again," she said, "what do I tell him?" Damien turned his head to look at her. "Tell him you'll meet." "And when I meet him?" "You won't be meeting him alone." She held his gaze. "He's going to want proof I'm serious. Proof I'm genuinely turning. He's not going to accept a meeting without confirmation that I have something real to offer." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," she said slowly, "that I actually have something real to offer. I was in your household for 2 years. I was present at events your lawyers kept me away from the formal record of. I heard things. I observed things. Things that, if I testified to them, would be damaging." He stared at her. "I'm not going to testify to them," she said. "I'm going to make Romano believe I will. And when he brings me in to meet his attorney, your people will be positioned." The room was quiet for a moment. "You're proposing to use yourself as bait," Damien said. "I'm proposing to use Romano's own tactic against him," she said. "He used me as a frame. I'll use his belief in that frame." She held his gaze steadily. "I need you to trust me to do this." She watched him absorb that, watched the inventory happening behind his eyes, not calculating her value, she thought, but calculating the risk to her, which was different and mattered. "I don't like it," he said. "I'm not asking you to like it," she said. "I'm asking you to trust it." A long silence. "All right," he said. "Well, Romano called at 6 in the morning. She was standing on the hospital's ground floor near a window that looked out onto a parking structure, coffee in hand. Real coffee this time, from a cart in the lobby, strong enough to constitute an argument, when the unknown number appeared on her screen. She let it ring twice. Mrs. Cross, he said. You made a mistake last night, she said, sending men to my house. I sent men to you, he said. Damien's people complicated the collection. That's on him. You sent men to a house with a pregnant woman in it, she said, and now Damien is in a hospital and I am standing in it, and I want you to understand something. She kept her voice low and level, the register she'd been working at for months. I was considering your offer before last night. I was genuinely weighing it. And then you sent people with guns to a house where I was sleeping. A pause. That wasn't directed at you. Everything that happens in my proximity is directed at me, she said. I've spent 2 years learning that. Another pause, longer. What do you want, Mrs. Cross? I want what you offered, she said. Protection, resources, and the ability to confirm what I know about the Cross operation to your attorney. But I want to meet in person, just you, not a phone call. That's a significant ask. You asked me to betray my husband, she said. We're past the point of minor asks. She heard him thinking, the particular quality of silence that was calculation rather than absence. There's a property in Terrytown, he said. I'll text you an address. Come alone. No Damien's people. I'll come alone, she said. She ended the call and went back upstairs and stood in the doorway of Damien's room and told him the address before Romano's text even arrived. Reyes was already on his phone. They gave her a wire that sat flat against her sternum, beneath her shirt, held in place by medical tape that pulled at the skin when she breathed deeply. Reyes showed her where it was, how to confirm it was transmitting, what to do if it failed. He did this with the same practical courtesy he'd shown her the night before, which she appreciated. Damien had tried to get out of bed twice. Twice she had put her hand on his chest. Twice he had, with visible effort, stayed where he was. On the second occasion he had said very quietly, "Come back," and she had said, "I will," with enough certainty that she almost convinced herself. She drove herself. Her Jeep, not one of Damien's vehicles. Reyes's people would be in position before she arrived. 4 separate vehicles, staggered approach routes, establishing a perimeter that Romano's own people would not detect, because they would be watching for a cross motorcade rather than unmarked civilian cars driven by people who had been doing this kind of work since before Romano had consolidated his territory. She had been told all of this. She trusted it with approximately 70% of her available confidence, which was the most she thought honesty allowed. The remaining 30% she kept in the back of her mind and drove. The property in Terrytown was a waterfront house, not Romano's primary residence, clearly, but one of those secondary holdings that significant criminal money accumulated like a body accumulates bruises, almost incidentally. It sat back from the river behind a fence with actual security cameras rather than the ornamental kind, and when she pulled up to the gate, a man came out to meet her and asked for her phone. She handed it over. This was expected. Reyes had given her a second device, a cheap prepaid in her coat pocket, that contained nothing useful to Romano but would, when she touched the power button 3 times in a specific sequence, send a confirmation signal to Reyes's team. She had practiced the sequence in the hospital parking lot. She could do it with the phone still in her pocket, with no visible movement. She did it as the man walked her toward the front door. Inside, the house was the kind of expensive that announced itself without the particular taste that transformed cost into character. She clocked the layout automatically. Entry, main room to the left, hallway to the right, stairs ahead, 2 men visible with the posture of men who were not interior decorators. Romano was in the main room. She had built a picture of him from fragments, Damien's descriptions, the voice on the phone, the way Damien's men mentioned his name with the specific flatness reserved for things they considered genuinely dangerous. The man in front of her was in his 60s, thick through the shoulders, with white hair cut close and eyes the particular pale gray of lake ice in March. He was wearing a suit that was not ostentatious, which she noted as more dangerous than if it had been. Men who didn't need to perform their power were the ones who actually had it. "Mrs. Cross," he said. He was standing. He gestured to the couch across from his chair. She sat. He sat. There was no coffee offered, which told her he considered this meeting short. "You said you came to confirm what you know," he said. No preamble. "Yes. My attorney is in the next room." He nodded toward the hallway. "Before I bring him in, I want to understand your terms." "Protection for me and my child," she said. "Resources sufficient to establish a new residence under a new name, and clarity on what happens to Adrian's daughter. The child isn't your concern." "I'm making it my concern," she said. Because she's 4 years old and she's been used as a piece on a board by people who should know better than that. She held his gaze. Including you. His pale eyes assessed her. You're bolder in person than I expected. You expected someone desperate, she said. I'm not desperate. I have options. You're one of them. I want to understand what you actually offer before I choose you. What you observed, he said, during the marriage, specifically. I was present at a meeting in October of the year before last, she said. This was true. She had been. The Northern Territory consolidation. I heard names, numbers, and a specific conversation about port access in New Haven that I believe contradicts the cross-organization's legal filings for that period. This was also true. She had told Damien this in the car on the way to the hospital, the conversation compressed into the tight space of what mattered and what she was willing to use. He had listened with his hand pressed to his shoulder, and his face the color of old plaster, and he had said, "all right again," that simple word that seemed to be expanding its meaning every time he used it. Romano leaned forward slightly. You can testify to specific figures. I can, she said, and you'd be willing to do that. I'm willing to have the conversation with your attorney, she said, which is what I said. He studied her for a moment. Then he sat back and said, to the room in general, bring Evelyn in. She processed the name for a half-second before the door to the hallway opened and a woman came through. Not an attorney, she understood that immediately from the way the room's energy shifted, from the way the two visible men moved, from the way Romano's expression changed from assessment to something that had an edge of theater in it. The woman was in her 30s, dark-haired, and looked at Evelyn with an expression that was professional and blank and entirely wrong for the situation, which meant she had been prepared for this moment and was managing her preparation. This is Elena Vasquez, Romano said. She's been managing the northern operations for the past 14 months, he paused. She's also been managing Damien. Evelyn looked at the woman, at Romano, back at the woman. The Belmont girl, she said quietly. Elena Vasquez's expression did not change. That was its own answer. The name Marcus had used in the study, the night of the party. You've been talking to the Belmont girl. Damien had said it was a separate matter. She had filed it and not opened the file again because there had been too many other files to manage. Belmont was a cover name, Romano said, watching her face the way a man watched a dial he was calibrating. Ms. Vasquez has been inside the Cross organization in various capacities for over a year. Her primary function has been to assess Damien's intentions regarding the Romano territories and to identify potential pressure points. Evelyn was very still. You're telling me, she said, that the woman my husband has been involved with is your operative. I'm telling you, Romano said, that your husband has been feeding information to what he believed was a private interest while he was actually feeding it to me. His voice carried the satisfaction of a man revealing a structure he'd built with patience. Every reassurance he gave you about managing the Romano situation, every piece of strategy he discussed with Marcus Hale in rooms he believed were private. Ms. Vasquez was present for the aftermath of most of those conversations. The wire against her sternum felt very flat and very present. She thought, Reyes is hearing this. She thought, Damien doesn't know. She thought, Romano is telling me this because he wants me to feel that Damien has been as compromised and exposed as I have. He wants me to feel that we are equally deceived. He wants that to be the thing that finally tips me. She looked at Elena Vasquez and said, Did he know what you were? No, Elena said, one word, flat. The response of a professional who had been asked a question she expected. Does he know now? Evelyn said. He's in a hospital bed, Romano said. He knows a great many things he didn't know last night. Does he know about her? Evelyn said. Not yet, Romano said. She absorbed this, sat with the specific weight of it, the layering of deceptions, the architecture of it, Romano's operatives inside Damien's household, while Adrian was selling from within, while Evelyn herself had been walking through it all, apparently transparent to everyone, apparently the most naive person in a building full of professionals. She thought about the 7 minutes on the stair, the paint on the front room wall, Rowan Ashcroft Cross. She thought, no, not naive, navigating. There was a difference, and the difference was that she had come out the other side. I want to speak to your attorney now, she said. Romano nodded and stood. I'll send him in. He left the room. Elena Vasquez followed him, and the two men who had been standing at the edges followed her, and Evelyn was alone in the room for approximately 4 seconds before she pressed the power button of the prepaid phone in her pocket in the sequence Reyes had given her. The signal was the one that meant, "Move now, Shab." What happened next was not clean. She had been told it would not be clean, and she had believed the telling, but belief and experience were different instruments. The sound of Reyes's team breaching the perimeter was not the percussive chaos of Blackwood. It was faster, more coordinated, the specific controlled violence of people who had planned the geometry of this particular building and were now executing within it. She heard shouts. She heard the particular sounds of men being taken down. She stayed on the couch with her hands flat on her thighs the way Reyes had told her to, visible and still, not a complicating variable. Romano made it to the back of the house before they caught him. She knew this because she heard him, not his words, but his voice, the specific register of a man who had not expected to be running and was doing it anyway, and then the sounds of that being ended, and then quiet. One of Reyes's men came through the main room door and looked at her. "Ma'am, you need to come with me." "Romano," she said. "Contained." "Vasquez." "Contained." She stood up. Her legs were entirely steady, which surprised her, and then didn't. She had been in this state of compressed focus for hours, and her body had apparently decided to commit to it. She went with the man through the house and out to the side entrance, where two more of Reyes's people were moving with the equipment efficiency of people finishing a job, and where Romano was zip-tied and sitting against the exterior wall of the house with the specific expression of a man reassessing every decision that had led to this particular wall. She stopped in front of him. He looked up at her. "You underestimated me," she said. "I underestimated what you'd do," he said. "Not who you were." "That's the same thing," she said. She went to the car. She was 40 minutes outside Poughkeepsie when her phone rang. Not the prepaid, her regular phone, which Romano's man had returned to her before she'd gone inside because her arrival at the property had confirmed what Romano needed. Confirmed, and the phone was no longer a useful thing to withhold. "Damien," she answered. "Reyes told me," he said. "I know." "Vasquez." His voice was careful in a way that cost him something. She could hear it. "Yes," she said. A long silence. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't," she said. And she did. The conversation in the study, the one about the Belmont girl, had carried the specific flatness of a man managing a complication, not the specific flatness of a man managing a conspiracy. She had learned to read those tones. "It doesn't mean it didn't happen." "No," he said. "It doesn't." She drove. The Taconic was empty at this hour, the trees on either side bare and very still, the road unfolding in her headlights in the same way it had the first night she'd driven it. "Romano is in custody," she said. "Federal. Reyes made the call." "I know." "Elena Vasquez, too. She's going to cooperate. Reyes's read on it is that she'll flip fast." "Probably," Damien said, "which means the federal case against your organization becomes more complex," she said, "because she has 14 months of direct observation." "I know," he said, for the third time, and it carried the same weight as every time he'd used it in the kitchen at Blackwood, each repetition costing something new. "I can't protect you from that," she said. "I want to be honest with you. Whatever happens legally as a result of tonight, I'm not going to lie or obstruct. I'll tell the truth about what I know and what I don't." "I'm not asking you to protect me," he said. She believed him. "I'm going to come back to the hospital," she said. "And then I want to talk about what comes after. Not the legal situation, the actual after, what we're going to do." A pause. "All right. I mean a real conversation, Damien, not a managed one." "I know what you mean," he said. She drove. The hospital lights appeared on the horizon ahead. Not beautiful, the particular industrial brightness of a place that ran all night because the alternatives were worse. And she put both hands on the wheel and breathed through her nose and thought about everything that was still in motion, still unresolved, still requiring navigation. Adrian in Reyes's custody. His daughter somewhere safe, she hoped, genuinely hoped. Romano contained, but his organization still extant. The federal situation now complicated in new directions. Blackwood Manor with its broken east windows and the paint still drying on the front room wall. Damien in a hospital bed. The baby rolling in a way that had started to feel like a specific personality rather than a biological event. She was not finished, not remotely. But she was still moving, still deciding, still the person making choices rather than the person choices were made about. And that was, she thought, pulling into the hospital parking structure, something worth holding on to. She parked, turned off the engine, sat for a moment in the dark of the structure with her hands in her lap. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, different from Romano's. She opened it. This isn't over. As she stared at the screen, Adrian was in Reyes's custody. She had been told that. She had processed that as a closed variable, a resolved problem, something in the column of things that had been handled. But the text had come from somewhere. From a phone. From a man who was supposed to be zip-tied in the back of one of Reyes's vehicles, 40 minutes away. She called Reyes. It rang 4 times. It went to voicemail. She called the direct number he'd given her. The secondary line, the one for exactly this kind of situation. It rang twice. A voice she didn't recognize answered. Ms. Ashcroft. Not Reyes. Where is Reyes? She said. Mr. Reyes is unavailable, the voice said, with the particular careful neutrality of someone reading from a script they'd prepared. Adrian Cross is also unavailable. There was a complication during transport. She pressed her back against the car seat. The parking structure was very quiet. One fluorescent light at the far end flickered with the irregular rhythm of something about to fail. A complication, she said. Mr. Cross had assistance we hadn't accounted for, the voice said. We're working to resolve the situation. In the meantime, we'd recommend you not return to... She ended the call. She sat in this parking structure with her phone in her lap and the flickering light at the end and the text on her screen. This isn't over. And she thought about Adrian zip-tied against the Blackwood hallway wall with his face wet and his gun taken, and she thought about the specific phrase he'd used. Romano needs this done. Romano was in federal custody. That constraint no longer applied, which meant Adrian's motivation had shifted from Romano will hurt my daughter if I don't to something else. Something she needed to understand before she understood what came next. She got out of the car and went inside, moving fast but not running, her footsteps sharp on the parking structure concrete, because Damien was on the 3rd floor with a bullet hole in his shoulder and a reduced security team, and she had just learned that the man who had put the bullet there was no longer where he was supposed to be. She pushed through the stairwell door and took the stairs because the elevator was too slow and too enclosed. 3rd floor. Left. Down the corridor. Damien's room at the end. She opened the door. The room was dim. The monitor beeped its steady line. Damien was in the bed. Awake, she could tell from the set of his shoulders. And there was a man in the chair beside him who was not hospital staff and was not one of Reyes's team. He was loose-limbed and angular, and he had a gun resting on his thigh, with the casualness of someone who had already decided the conversation was over. Adrian Cross looked at her across the room with the expression of a man who had simplified his internal situation all the way down to its essential element. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. He had something in his left hand. She registered this after she registered the gun, the specific hierarchy of threat assessment that she had apparently developed over the past several hours without meaning to. A phone. He turned it to face her. The screen showed a live video feed. A small room. A child asleep on a cot. Dark-haired, small, her face slack with the complete unconsciousness of a 4-year-old who had been moved somewhere unfamiliar and had stopped fighting it. Damien's people moved her, Adrian said. I moved her back. Different location. He set the phone face up on his knee. I want 2 things. The federal detention order on Romano suspended, and Damien's signature on a transfer of the Harlem and Bronx territory operations to a holding company my people will manage. He said this with the flatness of a man who had prepared the list and reviewed it and was now simply reading it. If those 2 things happen in the next 3 hours, my daughter comes home. If they don't, stop, Damien said. It was the first thing he'd said. His voice was rough from the anesthesia and tight with the shoulder and something else underneath both of those. Something that Evelyn recognized from the kitchen table at Blackwood, from the hospital room an hour ago, from the one real thing she'd heard from him in 2 years. He was at the end of something. Adrian, Damien said, look at me. Adrian looked at him. The gun stayed on his thigh. The phone stayed face up. I know why you did it, Damien said. Not the Romano piece. I understand the money and the debt. I mean the rest of it. The thing underneath. His voice was very steady for a man who'd been shot 5 hours ago. You wanted me to see you. You've wanted that for 34 years. Every story at every dinner, every time you came to me with a problem. He paused. I didn't.
The room was very quiet. I didn't, Damien said again. And I'm not going to tell you that I'm sorry because I don't think sorry covers the distance. But I'm telling you that I see you now, right now. And what I see is a man who is about to do something to his own daughter that she'll carry for the rest of her life. Adrian's jaw was working. She's 4, Damien said. She doesn't know what this is. She just knows her father is somewhere in it. Don't make her carry this version of you. The monitor beeped. The fluorescent light above them hummed its single note.
Evelyn was standing 6 feet from Adrian, between him and the door, and she was looking at the phone on his knee, at the live feed, the sleeping child, the cot in the small room. And she was thinking about 3 hours, and the federal detention order, and the transfer document, and everything that Romano's organization had set in motion that Adrian was now attempting to carry forward alone because he had run out of any other structure to stand inside. Adrian's hand moved to the phone. Damien said, "Don't." And everything that happened in the next 4 seconds happened faster than any decision Evelyn made consciously. Adrian's hand going to the gun instead of the phone, Damien lurching upright against the monitor's screaming protest, the IV line pulling taut, the chair going back, and Evelyn moving because there was nothing else available. The 6 feet between her and Adrian collapsing in 2 steps, her hands going for the gun arm with the specific and entirely untrained desperation of someone who has calculated that inaction is worse than action and has committed to the calculation completely. The gun went off. The ceiling took it, a hole appearing in the acoustic tile above them, plaster dust falling in a thin white curtain. She had his wrist. Both hands. The gun between them, pointed at nothing useful, her weight against his arm, her back to his chest, his breath loud in her ear, his strength significantly greater than hers, the math of this not working in her favor for more than another few seconds. Damien was out of the bed. She registered this peripherally. The monitor still screaming, the IV line trailing, his face the color of the ceiling tile, the shoulder held at an angle that suggested he was managing the pain by not looking at it. He crossed the room in 4 steps and put his hand over Adrian's hand on the gun with the specific grip of someone who intended to end the argument about the gun right now. Adrian's resistance lasted 3 seconds. Then it didn't. The gun hit the floor. Evelyn let go of his wrist and stepped back and put her hand against the wall because her legs had made a decision about what was available to them, and the wall was useful. She breathed, in through her nose, the way she'd been taught. Damien had Adrian's wrist in his one functional hand and was looking at him with the expression she still didn't have a word for, but that she was beginning to think was not expressionless at all, was, in fact, the expression of a man who had been keeping something enormous behind a controlled face for a very long time and had simply, finally, let the control become insufficient. The door opened. Hospital security, 2 of them, drawn by the gunshot, radios already going. She pushed herself off the wall and moved to the center of the room and said, in the voice that lived on the other side of fear, "We need police. Federal, if you have a contact. And we need a welfare check on a child at a location I'm going to give you right now." She held out her hand to Adrian, palm up. He looked at her hand for a long moment. Then he gave her the phone with the live feed, the sleeping child, the cot in the small room. And she gave the location to the security guard, and the security guard relayed it, and somewhere across the river a 4-year-old girl was going to wake up in the morning, somewhere that wasn't the room on the screen. And the criminal architecture that had been built across the past year from debt and fear, and a man's need to be finally, fully seen, was coming apart at every seam, and Damien was standing in a hospital room with a bullet hole in his shoulder and no IV and his hand still on his cousin's wrist. And the ceiling had a hole in the acoustic tile where nothing important had been hit, and Evelyn stood in the center of all of it with plaster dust on her coat and her heart rate beginning, finally, to find its way back down towards something that could be sustained. The security guards were talking, radios were talking. Damien said something to Adrian in a voice too low for her to hear, and Adrian's head dropped forward, and whatever Damien said, it did not sound like a threat. She looked at the phone in her hand. The sleeping child on the feed. She thought about Rowan Ashcroft Cross, and the name she'd said out loud in a hallway, and what kind of world she intended to raise him into, and she thought, not this one, not this one. The plaster dust settled. That was the thing she remembered afterward. Not the gunshot, not the sound of the monitor screaming, not Damien crossing the room on a bullet-damaged shoulder with the IV line trailing behind him, like something he'd forgotten to account for. What she remembered was the plaster dust settling in the aftermath, the fine white particles drifting down through the hospital room light and landing on everything without discrimination, on the bed and the floor, and the back of her hand and Adrian's shoulder, equitable and indifferent the way only inanimate things could be. The federal agent who arrived 40 minutes later was a woman named Carver. Compact, mid-40s, with the particular weariness of someone who had seen this specific room, with these specific variables, more times than the job description had originally suggested. She looked at the ceiling tile. She looked at the gun on the floor. She looked at Damien in the bed. Back in it, the nurses having won the argument about the IV. And at Adrian in the chair with his wrists zip-tied to the arm. And at Evelyn standing near the window with plaster dust on her coat and her hand on her abdomen. She said, "Someone give me the version that explains the ceiling." Evelyn gave it to her, straight through, start to finish, with the specific clarity of a person who had been composing this account in her mind for the 40 minutes between the gunshot and Carver's arrival. She included the wire and its transmission, the meeting with Romano, Elena Vasquez's name and function, Adrian's debt and his daughter's location, and the text message that had come from a phone Adrian wasn't supposed to have. Carver listened without interrupting. This was, Evelyn thought, either professional discipline or the response of someone who had learned that interrupting people who were being this precise was counterproductive. When Evelyn finished, Carver looked at Damien. "The territorial transfer he demanded," she said. "Were you going to sign it?" "No," Damien said, "even with the child in play." "I was working on another solution," Damien said. Carver looked at Evelyn. "He was working on another solution," Evelyn confirmed. Carver wrote something in her notebook. Then she looked at Adrian, who had been looking at the floor since the agents arrived and had not yet looked up. "The child," Carver said to him. "Is she yours?" "Yes," Adrian said to the floor. "Her mother." "Not in the picture," he said. "Has been for about a year." "So you were her primary caregiver?" "Yes." "And Romano leveraged her?" "Yes." His voice was flat but not dead. There was something underneath it that Evelyn had heard in the hallway at Blackwood and was hearing again here. The sound of a man who had made catastrophic choices for reasons he couldn't explain in a way that would sound like anything other than failure. "She's been located," Carver said. "She's fine. Child Services is with her currently. We'll need to sort out placement." Adrian's head came up. "Placement. Temporary. While your situation is being assessed. She stays with family," Adrian said, and his voice was no longer flat. Carver looked at Damien. A long pause in the room. The monitor beeped. Somewhere down the corridor a cart moved, its wheels squeaking in the institutional rhythm of a building that never fully stopped. "She can stay at Blackwood," Evelyn said. Everyone looked at her. "It's my property," she said. "My name on the deed. I'll take temporary guardianship while Adrian's situation is processed." She held Carver's gaze. "She's 4. She didn't do anything, and she needs somewhere that isn't a placement facility." Carver studied her for a moment. "You understand that taking in the child of someone who just held a gun in a room with you—" "I understand what I'm offering," Evelyn said. Carver wrote in her notebook again. "I'll need to process that through the right channels. It won't be instant." "I know," Evelyn said. "Do it through the right channels. I'll wait." Adrian was looking at her. She met his eyes once, briefly, without warmth and without hostility. A look that said simply, "This is what it is, and I'm doing it because of the child. Not because of you." He seemed to understand the distinction. He looked away. Carver finished with the room an hour later and took Adrian with her, and 2 more agents came and took the gun in an evidence bag and photographed the ceiling tile and left a card with a number for follow-up. The room was quiet again by 4 in the morning. Damien was awake. She sat in the chair Adrian had vacated and they were quiet together for a while, the monitor keeping its steady account, the window showing the particular deep blue of a winter night at its lowest point. "Vasquez," Damien said eventually. "Yes," she said. "I want to tell you what that was." "You don't have to." "I want to." He was looking at the ceiling rather than at her, which she thought was intentional. The same reason people found certain conversations easier in cars, the absence of direct eye contact making honesty cheaper to produce. "It was 6 months ago. It wasn't what I thought it was, and I don't think that exonerates anything, but I want you to have the accurate version." "All right," she said. She approached through Marcus, said she had information about Romano's eastern expansion that she wanted to sell. "We met twice. I thought we were meeting about information. She was good at her job." He stopped. "The third meeting was different, and I made a decision that I knew was wrong while I was making it, and made it anyway." She was quiet. "It ended after the third meeting," he said. I ended it. Not because of any strategic reason, because I couldn't. He stopped again, and she heard him working at something, the effort of producing language for a thing that had lived without language. Because I thought about you, specifically, and I couldn't. The room was very quiet. I'm not telling you this so you'll forgive it, he said. I'm telling you because you said you wanted real conversations. She looked at her hands in her lap. The blood from the shoulder wound had been washed off at some point during the hospital's interventions. She wasn't sure when. Her hands were clean and looked in the dim light, like someone else's hands. Thank you for telling me, she said. He finally turned his head to look at her. That's all. That's not all, she said. But it's all I have tonight, and tonight is what's actually happening. He looked at her for a long moment. Fair, he said. They didn't sleep. They sat with the monitor and the window and the institutional hum of the building. And somewhere around 5:30, the sky outside began its reluctant shift toward gray, and Evelyn thought about everything that was now in federal hands, and everything that was still in motion, and everything that was going to require navigation in the days and weeks ahead. And she also thought about Rowan Ashcroft Cross, the name she'd said out loud in a hallway, the name that had come from nowhere and landed like something that had always been there, waiting. She was going to need a better space heater for the baby's room. The thought arrived with the specific absurdity of ordinary life reasserting itself, and she almost laughed, and didn't quite, but the almost was something. The federal case took 8 months to build and 6 weeks to resolve. This was not how these things usually worked, Carver told her. Usually they took years. But Romano had been operating with the specific arrogance of someone who believed his organization was impenetrable, which meant his documentation was voluminous, and his people were unaccustomed to the particular mathematics of federal prosecution, which meant that when Elena Vasquez began cooperating, which happened within 72 hours of her detention, Carver's read having been accurate, the architecture of Romano's operation became visible with the thoroughness of a building with all its walls removed. Romano was charged on 43 counts. The number was almost abstract. Elena Vasquez received a reduced sentence in exchange for her cooperation, the terms of which were handled by lawyers Evelyn never met and didn't need to. She thought about Vasquez sometimes. Not often, not with the particular sustained energy that would have indicated something unresolved, but occasionally. The woman had been good at her job. She had done it in a direction that had caused significant damage. Those two things were both true and didn't cancel each other. Adrian pled guilty to 4 federal charges. His cooperation with the Romano investigation, including specific testimony about the information he'd provided and the manner in which Romano had recruited him, earned him a sentence that would see him out and functional while his daughter was still young enough that the gap might be bridgeable. Might. That was the word Carver used. Evelyn thought it was an honest word. Damien's organization was a different and more complicated matter. He had known it would be. She had known it would be. They had talked about it, actually talked, in the real conversation she'd demanded, and he'd slowly, imperfectly, begun to produce over the weeks following the hospital, sitting at the Blackwood kitchen table with the roof repaired above them, and Bill's crew working on the east windows, and a small dark-haired child named Mara running between the rooms with the complete physical confidence of a 4-year-old who had decided that this strange house was interesting rather than frightening. The federal exposure, Evelyn said, on a Tuesday morning in March, with the snow coming down outside and Mara asleep upstairs in the room that had been cleared and furnished for her, and Damien's shoulder in its 3rd week of physical therapy and still wrong at certain angles. I know, he said. Vasquez's testimony is going to... I know. She looked at him across the table. What are you going to do? He was quiet for a long time. His hands were flat on the table. She had come to read his hands as a secondary communication system. The tension or stillness in them carrying information his face had been trained to withhold. Right now, they were still. Cooperate, he said. She waited. The cross-organization, he said, and she heard something in the way he said it. Not grief exactly, something more like the sound of a man setting down something very heavy that he has been carrying for so long he has stopped noticing the weight. I built it from what my father left. I believed it was... I had a story about what it was. That it was order, structure, that the alternative was worse. He paused. I don't think I believe that story anymore. What changed? She said. He looked at her. I've been watching you rebuild this house, he said, with your own money, with contractors you hired yourself. making decisions about flooring and roof pitch and which walls to keep and which ones to take down. He paused. You built something real, with your hands and your money and your judgment, and I have spent my entire adult life building things that required someone else to be afraid. She held his gaze. I want to build something real, he said. I don't know how to do that yet, but I want to learn. She believed him, not completely. She had learned too much about the distance between what people said they wanted and what they were actually capable of to believe anyone completely on a Tuesday morning in March. But she believed him enough. She believed the weight she'd heard him set down. She believed the specific stillness of his hands. The federal cooperation, she said, it means giving up everything. Yes. The territories, the operations, the money that came from them. There's money that didn't, he said. Legitimate holdings. Enough. He paused. Enough for a roof and a baby's room. She looked out the window at the snow. It was coming down in the fat, unhurried flakes of a storm that had decided to take its time. All right, she said. What? Rowan Ashcroft Cross arrived on a Thursday in late April, 7 weeks early, in a way that nobody had planned for and nobody could have. She had been at Blackwood. Damien had been in the city for a meeting with federal attorneys. The cooperation agreement, the specifics of which had required 6 weeks of negotiation, and had produced a document she'd read twice and signed once as a witness. They had expected another 3 weeks. The baby had not consulted the timeline. Her water broke at 2 in the afternoon. She called the midwife practice in Rhinebeck, who told her to come in immediately. She called Damien, who was already in a car before she finished the sentence. She drove herself to Rhinebeck because the alternative was waiting, and waiting was not available to her. Mara was with a neighbor from the county road, an older woman named Ruth who had appeared at the Blackwood gate 3 weeks earlier with a casserole and the specific forthright manner of someone who had decided to be useful and was not interested in being dissuaded. Evelyn had accepted the casserole and the friendship with the particular gratitude of someone who had spent 2 years in a social environment that required performance and was only now remembering what ordinary warmth felt like. The labor was hard. This was the accurate description, and she had no interest in softening it. It was 7 hours of work that her body did with the concentrated brutality of a process that had been happening for the entirety of human history and had never once agreed to be comfortable about it. The midwife was steady and specific and did not offer reassurance, except in the form of accurate information, which was what Evelyn needed. Damien arrived 40 minutes after she did. He came into the room with his coat still on and his face the specific color of a man who had driven 2 hours and 90 minutes and was still processing the velocity. He looked at her and she looked at him and she said, without intending anything particular by it, "You made it." "Yes," he said, and took off his coat and stayed. He was not good at it, in the way that people who are not accustomed to being helpless are not good at situations requiring them to be helpless. He held her hand too tight and then not tight enough and said the wrong thing twice and the right thing once, which was, "You're the strongest person I've ever watched do anything." She told him not to be dramatic. He said he wasn't being dramatic. She believed him, which helped. Rowan arrived at 9:17 in the evening, 3 pounds 14 ounces, with a face that was the compressed and private face of someone not yet ready to have opinions about the exterior world. He was taken immediately to the NICU at the hospital they'd transferred to, and Evelyn watched him go with the specific terror of a person who has fought for something and is now required to trust other people with it. She did not sleep that night. Damien sat beside her in a chair that was significantly less comfortable than the one at Poughkeepsie and did not suggest that she should. Rowan spent 3 weeks in the NICU. She drove to the hospital every day. Damien came 4 of the 7 days each week, and on the 3 days he wasn't there, he called. And she told him what the nurses had said and what the monitors showed and what Rowan's weight was. And Damien listened with the complete attention of a man who had recalibrated his understanding of what deserved it. On the day Rowan came home to Blackwood, Mara stood on the front porch in her rubber boots and watched the car come up the gravel approach with the serious expression of a child who has been told something important is happening and has decided to be solemn about it. When Evelyn carried Rowan up the porch steps, Mara looked at him for a long time. "He's small," she said. "He'll get bigger," Evelyn said. "Does he have a name?" "Rowan." Mara considered this. "That's okay," she said, and went back inside, which constituted acceptance. The federal cooperation process took the rest of the year. Damien testified on 11 separate occasions. She did not attend any of these sessions, partly because her testimony had already been provided separately, and she didn't want to conflate the records. And partly because she thought he needed to do it without her in the room. He needed to do it as himself, not as someone she was witnessing. He came home after each session, and he was quiet in the way of a man who has spent a day in rooms where his entire adult life has been treated as evidence, and she gave him the quiet without filling it. And after dinner, when Rowan was down and the house was still, sometimes he talked and sometimes he didn't, and she learned to read which was which. He told her once, in October, sitting on the Blackwood porch with the autumn coming down through the oak tree in the specific reds and yellows of that valley, about the day his father had first brought him into the business. He had been 16. His father had sat him down in the study of the Cross family home in Connecticut and explained the organization the way other fathers explained compound interest or car maintenance, as a fact of the world that required management rather than questioning. I didn't question it, Damien said. He was looking at the tree. The cold had come back in the nights, and he was wearing a jacket he'd had for years, old canvas, not expensive, that she'd never seen him wear in the city. I assumed it was what men like us did, what our family was. What did you think you were? She said. He was quiet for a moment. Necessary, he said. I think I thought I was necessary. That the order I maintained was that without it something worse would fill the space. Maybe that was true, she said. Maybe, he said. It might still be true in some version, but it became something I told myself rather than something I actually believed. And I kept telling myself it until he stopped. Until what? She said. Until I heard a recording of myself talking about you, he said, and I sounded like my father discussing a business decision. She looked at the oak tree. When did you hear the recording? She said. Federal attorneys played it in the third session, he said. The study conversation, Marcus and me, the one you heard through the wall. She was quiet. I've heard it 3 times now, he said. The first time I was angry at Adrian for recording it. The second time I was... He stopped again. He was working at something. She had learned to wait for these moments rather than fill them. The third time I just heard myself, without any frame around it, just what I said and how I said it. And, she said. And it wasn't who I want to be, he said. Simple. Flat. The statement of a man who had run the accounting all the way down to its foundation. She looked at him in the particular amber light of the October afternoon, in the canvas jacket she'd never seen in the city, and she thought about the man she'd watched across a charity event in Greenwich when she was 26. The man who had been exactly what he appeared to be, and nothing else, no depth to locate. And she thought, there is depth. There was always depth. It was just that for a long time neither of them had required him to produce it. It's not who I want you to be either, she said. He looked at her. But you're not that person anymore, she said, and I think you know that, and I think that's the only thing that actually matters about it. He held her gaze for a long moment. His hands were still in his lap, the canvas jacket old and worn at the elbows, the oak tree coming down in pieces around them. I know, he said. What? The Cross organization's dissolution was completed by the following spring. The territories were surrendered, the operations shut down or transferred to federal receivership, the money that could be traced to illegal origins forfeited. What remained was clean, or clean enough, which was the honest version of a situation that could not be made entirely clean, but could be made livable. Damien sold the Manhattan penthouse. He did this without consulting her, which she called him on, and he acknowledged it without defensiveness, which was new enough that she noted it as a specific kind of progress. Where do you want to go, she said, when the penthouse sells? He looked around the Blackwood kitchen. The linoleum was fully gone now. She'd replaced it with tile, old-fashioned hexagonal white with gray grout, that matched what her grandmother's kitchen would have had originally. The chandelier in the entry hall had 12 working bulbs. The east windows were repaired and sealed against the winter. Here, he said. This house, she said. This house, he said. Unless you... I've been here for 8 months, she said. I'm not going anywhere. Then neither am I, he said. He moved to Blackwood in June. Mara had gone back to her mother, Adrian's sister, who had stepped in once the legal situation clarified. A woman named Diane, who arrived at the Blackwood gate with the specific purposeful warmth of someone who understood that gratitude was inadequate but was offering it anyway. Evelyn had stood on the porch and watched Mara go down the gravel approach holding Diane's hand, rubber boots on despite the June warmth, and had felt the particular bittersweetness of a child who had been temporary being returned to the permanent. She had sent Mara with a stuffed rabbit that had become her specific attachment object in the Blackwood months, and a note for Diane that said simply, "She is brave. Tell her that." The room that had been Mara's became, after some discussion and a new coat of paint in a particular shade of green that Evelyn had found in a sample book and spent 3 days deciding about, the room for Rowan's younger sister. She arrived 14 months after Rowan, full term and loud about it from the first moment, dark-haired like her father, with her mother's specific quality of looking at a room as if she'd already assessed it and was deciding what to do about it. They named her Clara, for the friend in Brooklyn who had been Evelyn's one maintained connection through the marriage years, who had cried on the phone when Evelyn called from the Rhinebeck Hospital and said, "I need you to come meet my daughter." Clara the friend came the next week and sat in the Blackwood kitchen with Evelyn and drank coffee that was now consistently good, because Evelyn had bought a proper machine and looked around the house with the expression of someone encountering something they had not known how to picture. "This is real," Claire said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "You built this." "Mostly Bill," Evelyn said. "I had good judgment about which walls to keep." Clara laughed. The sound of it went through the kitchen and up the stairs and into the rooms of the house, and Clara the daughter, asleep in the nursery, was apparently not moved by it, which the pediatrician had said was a very good sign. The letter had been in the back of the accessory drawer since the night Evelyn left. She had taken her documents, the passport, the bank card, the Blackwood deed, and she had taken the pregnancy test, and she had left the ring, but the letter she had written and then torn up had been rewritten in the days after she arrived at Blackwood, in the quiet of the early mornings when she couldn't sleep, and the house was just herself and the cold and the single working bulb. It was addressed to no one. It was not a farewell letter and not a manifesto and not a document she'd ever intended to show anyone. It was 3 pages in her own handwriting on the notepad paper from the house's original furnishings, and it said everything she'd needed to say when there was no one available to say it to, about the study corridor and the ring on the nightstand and the pregnancy test and the 6 hours in between, about what she'd believed her life was and what she'd discovered it actually was, about the woman she'd stopped being able to find when she looked in mirrors with $1,700 lighting. She had kept it. She wasn't sure why, through all of it, the Blackwood months, the federal process, the NICU weeks, the slow work of building something that was actually a life rather than the performance of one. She had kept it in the drawer of the nightstand in the room she'd claimed on the first night, and she had not reread it, and she had not thrown it away. On the morning of October 14th, which was the 1-year anniversary of the night she'd walked out of the Manhattan penthouse through the servants' entrance into the cold, she got up before Damien and before the children and went downstairs and made coffee and went out to the porch. The oak tree had turned completely. The valley below was the particular russet and gold of a Hudson Valley October, the colors so specific to this time and this place that they seemed deliberate rather than incidental, as if the landscape had decided to make a point. She had the letter in her coat pocket. The gray wool coat, slightly too large, the one she'd been wearing the night she left. She still wore it. It fit differently now. She fit differently now, in ways that had nothing to do with postpartum, and everything to do with the person who occupied the space inside the coat. She read the letter one more time on the porch, in the October morning, with the coffee warm in her other hand. It was the voice of a woman she recognized and no longer was. Not because that woman had been wrong. She had been entirely right, about everything, with the precision of someone who had been paying attention in a room that preferred her not to. But because being right is not the same as being finished, and that woman had been in the middle of something she hadn't yet come out the other side of. She was on the other side now. She set the coffee down on the porch rail and took the lighter from her coat pocket. She had put it there this morning specifically. And she lit the corner of the letter and held it over the iron planter at the edge of the porch, the one that had held dead geraniums when she arrived and now had the woody remnants of the herbs she'd grown through the summer. The paper caught and went quickly, the way thin paper does. The words disappearing in an order that wasn't meaningful but felt like one. She held it until her fingers were close to the heat and then let it drop into the planter and watched it finish. The smoke rose in a thin line in the still October air and then dispersed. She picked up her coffee. Behind her, through the door she'd left open, she heard Rowan. 18 months old now, and recently in possession of a theory about mornings that involved them starting immediately and loudly, beginning to make his case from the upstairs bedroom. She heard Damien's voice, low and unhurried, the specific register he'd developed over the past year for the children, different from any voice she'd heard from him before. She heard Rowan's protest, and then Damien's voice again, and then, improbably, quiet. She stood on the porch and listened to the quiet. She thought about the woman who had stood at the nightstand and looked at a ring for a long time before deciding to leave it behind. She thought about the servant's entrance and the cold alley and the taxi and the Taconic at midnight and the gate with the rust on the hinges and the single working bulb and the 7 minutes on the stairs. She thought, that woman saved herself. Alone, in the dark, with a pregnancy test and a property deed, and 16 months of quiet preparation and the specific stubbornness of someone who had been underestimated so consistently that she'd learned to use the underestimation. She thought, and then she saved everyone else too. Not because she was built for it, because no one else was doing it. The morning light was coming through the oak tree in the particular way it came through on October mornings, at that angle, in that valley, broken into specific pieces by the branches. It landed on the porch rail and on her hands and on the planter where the letter had been. And it was not cinematic, and it was not significant, and it was everything. The door opened behind her. Damien came out with Rowan on his hip, the child still in pajamas, dark-haired, looking at the world with the slightly imperious expression that had become his characteristic posture, already so completely himself at 18 months that it was almost funny. Damien had spit up on his shoulder that he either hadn't noticed or had noticed and decided not to address, which was its own kind of information about how much had changed. He stood beside her at the porch rail and looked at the valley. "You're up early," he said. "I had something to do," she said. He looked at the planter, at the ash, then at her. She looked back at him with the same directness she'd given him across the kitchen table, across the hospital room, across every room they'd been in over the past year, the look that said, "I see you specifically, and I am choosing to be here, specifically, and that choice is mine, and I make it every morning." He held her gaze. "Okay," he said. "Yes," she said. Rowan made a sound that constituted an opinion about the cold and reached for Evelyn with both arms, and she handed the coffee to Damien and took the boy, and he was warm and specific and entirely himself against her chest, and the valley was doing what it did in October, the colors and the light and the cold and all of it, and the house behind them was warm and imperfect and full of the particular organized chaos of people who had chosen each other out of the wreckage and were building something real. She pressed her face briefly into the top of Rowan's head. He smelled like sleep and something sweet in himself. She thought, this is not a happy ending. Happy endings are for people who believe the story is over. This is a morning. The next morning after the one before it, the same way all mornings come. Improbable, unremarkable, continuous. The valley doing what valleys do. The house holding what it holds. The people in it carrying what they carry and choosing, again, to stay. She lifted her head and looked at the tree line. Clara would be awake soon. She always woke before anyone expected her to, with the specific impatience of someone who had decided the world was interesting and was not willing to wait for it to present itself. Evelyn had named her correctly. She looked at the oak tree and at the valley and at the morning light coming through both of them, and she breathed and she stayed.